Hello everybody. So we're gonna go ahead and talk a little bit about places and spaces this week and how they're important. Once I get my camera. Okay, cool. Alright, so what I want to talk about this week is actually why setting can be so important, and I'm going to do that in some odd ways because the resources I'm giving you this week are technically not from poetry, but we're going to use them to talk about poetry. So what I'm actually referencing here is some of the stuff I use in my eco-criticism unit when I'm talking about literary criticisms in a lit class, and one of them is called the different stages of natural landscapes, and it's something we use in something called experiential learning, which is basically learning through experiencing something ourselves, and I want to talk about why that's important. So the first thing we're looking at is those natural stages of experiential learning, and this is something that was devised by a man named James Raffin and was eventually used in literary and eco-criticism to talk about the different levels we might reach in certain stories. So what essentially this means is that different types of experiences and different interactions with natural landscapes can give us different sets of connections with that landscape. So essentially, the better we know a place, the more experience we have with it, the more likely we are to connect with it. But James Raffin has identified like 4 different levels of these and how we reach them. So the first level is called the toponymic, and essentially that translates to naming of place. So topography, place, nymic naming. And this is how we understand real life settings from learning about the names of places and topographical features. This is actually the one I find most interesting because it can be very general or it can be very specific. So think about, for instance, if I were to pull up an image of a forest on the screen and asked you where that forest was, could we identify it? And actually, let's just go ahead and do that now. Okay, here is a forest. What would we do to try to figure out where this is? We might start out initially by going, have I seen something like this before? And if so, what about it is familiar and what's unfamiliar? We might point out types of trees or plants that are familiar, the kinds of like how spaced out things are, the types of like shrubbery in the bottom of the forest floor, and we go from there. And we could do this with a variety of different forests. So for instance, that image is tiny, but I think I can make it work. Here is a different kind of forest, and you'll notice that there are many things about that type of forest that are very different than the first. And we might even have something like this forest, which is even slightly different than the first couple ones. So they all have like small distinctive qualities about them, and if we are able to identify what's similar or different from our own experiences with these forests, then we can start to get closer to our connections. So like in this one, I see a lot of moss, and I know moss is going to happen in like wet places, and so maybe that's familiar, but there's a lot of really twisted trees, and maybe that's less familiar. Can we identify the types of trees? Because if we could, then that would help us identify maybe where they are. So you see how naming things can be helpful. That's a very kind of general example of what I'm talking about, but this can get a lot more in depth. So when we know the names of places, or even things within the place, then I can understand a lot more about its history. So this is where I start to talk about McKinley and Denali, the mountain in Alaska that was originally named Denali by the First Nation settlers who lived there, based on their own cultural histories, and was eventually renamed McKinley, or rather, yeah, it was eventually renamed McKinley when Alaska was gifted to the United States, and we decided to rename the mountain after President McKinley. And so there's a lot of politics that go into this about renaming a place after it's been gifted to us. It's a very colonialist legacy to be able to decide we own a place and then be able to rename it and remove all the history that comes with something being called Denali, and what that means in the First Nations languages and what it means to now call it McKinley. Obama actually changed Mount McKinley back to Mount Denali in, I think, 2008. I think that was in his first term. And so that was kind of a major political move to say, hey, we're recognizing that this was a problematic way for us to handle a situation, namely getting the state name renamed the mountain. And so we want to give that name back to its original owners. So names have a lot of power. But there's also so many really cool things we can learn when we know names of things. So here's a really cool set of lists. So this is actually an extra coded exercise I do in my my Lit and my 1102 classes. When we do this exercise is I ask them to think about as many different types of bodies of waters as they possibly can. And you can do this yourself too. So things like lake, right? We've got things like streams, rivers, creeks, oceans. Like how many different types of bodies of water can you think of? And then repeating that process with like geological formations, right? So mountains, sure, but then there's also cliffs. There's arêtes, which is the name of a geological feature where like a cliffside comes to a point, sort of like a nose, like we're like looking at a nose from the side. That's called an arête. Aiguille is a French word for the peak of a mountain. So looking at kind of how much experience we already have with naming some of these things. These are actually called hydronyms for types of water and oronyms for the geological formations. And there's actually quite a lot of them. They are all called toponyms, so you can understand why we would call these toponymic as this kind of first set of learning about a place. There's a bunch of different types of these. So there's like helonyms, which are names for specific swamps, marshes, and bogs. There are just so many different kinds of toponyms. And if you are interested, looking up a list of toponyms would be pretty neat. It's just kind of even just seeing how many you know and how many are completely unfamiliar to you. Could be pretty fun. Let me show you actually one last example before we move on. So this is a book called An Exaltation of Larks, and this is an entire book dedicated to the collective nouns for different animals and creatures and natural things. So there is a specific name for a collective noun of any kind of animal. So like you've probably heard of a murder of crows. That's what we're referring to here when we say collective noun. It's a group of, middle-aged women called it's a Karen. So I mean, there's a ton of these, and being able to identify these adds to our language and the way we can talk about a place and the people in it and the culture that we experience there. And there's actually an entire just council of, I imagine, Old English nerds who get together once a year and decide when we need a new collective noun and vote on what it should be, and like they let the public help vote too, and it's kind of cool. But so those are some examples of how toponyms might help us understand a place better. If we can understand why someone would call something a creek versus a crick versus like a stream or something else, it tells us a little bit about the people, the place, and the culture there. And learning about these different types of geographical and topographical features gives us more language to be able to describe things more completely. So the toponymic stage is extremely important. It's also very broad. The next stage is the narrative stage. And in this stage, we use stories, oral histories, whether real or not real, to connect with real life settings. So for instance, if you've never been to a place but you've heard a story about it, then you have a certain expectation of what that place is like based on the narrative story. So for instance, you might have heard like maybe an old wives' tale about some kind of place, or like a local legend of a place you've never been to. Like there's a bridge in South Carolina that my friends always said was haunted, and like if you went out there at night you could hear a baby crying, and so places have all of these like myths and folklores built into them, and settings can hold a lot of history, and so these narratives help perpetuate that culture, that feeling of the place, and the mood we create with setting. The third level is the experiential level. This is when you get a slightly deeper connection to a place from having experienced it yourself. I'm going to give you an example of what this is like a little bit later on. And then the fourth stage is the numinous. This is a stage that is essentially a connection to a place so deep that it can only be described as spiritual, where you know a place so well that the way you understand it is felt more than known, where you might be able to just kind of explore a place through feelings instead. And I mean, if I can give you an example of this, my example would be that I feel very comfortable in swamps because I grew up in a swamp, and so I actually have this. You probably can't see it, but I have a tattoo on the back of my neck that is just a German word, and it says Waldeinsamkeit, and that means in the German, a German poet came up with it, and it was roughly the feeling of being alone in the woods. It translates to forest independence, and the poet used that originally to describe the feeling of being alone in the woods as both simultaneously comforting and terrifying, where you know you're alone, and that might be what you want, but also you're alone. And what does that mean? And it's so like this is kind of a numinous connection I have with forests and swamps because I grew up in them, and that's the kind of feeling I like. But even if you haven't been to a place, sometimes we go to places that are new and we realize that we immediately connect with the mood and the feeling and the like kind of tone of a place. And if you've ever felt that, you probably kind of know what I'm talking about. But until you do, it's very hard to connect with. And this is why it's an entirely different stage. So ideally, we have to go through these stages in order to understand a place. And that's why the toponymic is the first stage. It's so large, and then the other are a little bit deeper, one at a time. And I can give you an example of how this might work in poetry. So this is a poem called Elms by Louise Gluck. It's very short, and Louise Gluck did just win the Nobel Prize of Literature for 2020, and it is extremely well deserved. She's a fantastic poet. And this is Elms, so I'll go ahead and read it. All day I tried to distinguish need from desire. Now, in the dark, I feel only bitter sadness for us, the builders, the planers of wood, because I've been looking steadily at these elms and seen the process that creates the writhing, stationary tree is torment, and have understood it will make no forms but twisted forms. So there may not immediately be a lot of language in here that we feel like we need to look up. But something is happening that, unless you understand specifically what she's referring to, might make you feel a little bit disconnected from this poem. And because there's not a lot of toponyms, it is actually a little bit harder to figure that out. So one of the things we can do by starting out is looking up elms. So just before you even start, do you know if you've seen an elm? Could you identify an elm tree? What do they look like? Just start there. And if you have no idea, then it's a good time to hop on over to Google Images. So this is a pretty boring Google search. These all just look like trees. So we keep going. See if I can just isolate elms. So I know what their leaves look like. Let's see what else we can do. So I hopped on over to the elm Wikipedia page, and I mean, I scrolled through a little bit. But I can see a couple pictures, a little bit about like some of the issues they experience. There's apparently a Dutch elm disease that happens. And there's a section on landscaping where something caught my eye because the street in Lafayette Street in Salem looks pretty cool. And this is an example of the high tunneled effects commonly used in New England. Okay, so filing that away, not sure if it'll be useful. Can look at the uses of its wood. There's also apparently a list of notable elm trees, which is interesting. We've got elms in art. Okay, so maybe this has given me something and I'm not quite sure what yet. I'm going to do a Google search that might sound silly, but in this poem, she's talking about how they're writhing and tormented and twisted. So what I did next was I Googled, why are elm trees twisted? And I found something about Ulmus tortuosa. So the twisted elm is actually an interesting phenomenon that appears to just happen in a lot of types of elms. This particular picture is kind of a pretty good example of an elm that's twisted and something that I can see a poet describing as tortured. And this reminded me a lot of that high tunnel effect, which we see a lot more of over here, and many of these pictures do appear to include elms. From my general, very basic knowledge of elms this far, but it's helping me make an assumption that Louise Gluck is probably looking at something like these, twisted hallways of trees when she is talking about elms in this poem. So let's go back to the poem then. All right, so she's been looking at the elms and she's seen the process that creates this writhing torment, or that creates the writhing is torment. So this implies that something is being done to the trees to create this shape, and that the shape is probably wanted by someone else, but it seems not to be wanted by the tree, or maybe something else. But she also says she's understood that it will make no forms but twisted forms. So perhaps the elm has just been kind of bent out of shape for so long that it's only now going to produce these zigzagging serpentine shapes. And so just knowing a little bit more about that, knowing a little bit more about kind of how we shape trees in general, I'm thinking here of landscaping and bonsai, tells us a little bit about what might be happening in this poem and what Louise Gluck maybe saw and the place that she was in. Gives us a little bit more to connect to. And then I come back to this first line, all day I try to distinguish need from desire. And I think that's where the crux of the poem is, when we talk about how we shape trees for our own needs as humans to create, whether it's this high tunnel effect or maybe like an arch in a garden, or keeping a tree small so we can turn it into a bonsai, is that need or desire? And it seems to be asking a question about whether or not this is a problem. And so just by looking up a little bit into the places, the names that we're looking at in these poems, we can understand a little bit more of what the poet's getting at. And this can be done with a lot more things than just setting, but I happen to think setting's a really evocative way to do it. Here's where I'll tell you a short story. This is A Brief History of Fire is one of the fictional stories we read in my fiction class and also in some of my lit classes, and I highly recommend it if you like short fiction. It's fantastic. But it's essentially about a woman who, after a traumatic experience, goes to live as a fire watcher alone in a fire tower in the Gila Wilderness in New Mexico. And we can read about her story and how isolated she was, but we don't really quite understand that isolation until we intentionally try to connect to it. So one thing I normally ask my students to do is think about the most physically isolated they've ever felt and what was similar or different to Sarah's experience in the story. But also I had an opportunity to go to a place very similar to that, and the reason I'm telling you about a story that you guys haven't read is because this was kind of just the perfect example for me to show how the difference between the narrative experience level and the experiential level. Because I was actually able to visit a very isolated fire tower, and this was in North Carolina. Went to the tip of that little peak right there, and it was about 5,000 feet of elevation. It was a 13-mile hike. It took my tiny Florida body 8-9 hours to get up and down that mountain because I am small and weak. And so I took this opportunity to catalog some of the things I noticed, like the difference between the temperature at the top and the bottom, how it was snowing at the top, and just kind of nice and breezy at the bottom, which meant we had to carry more clothing. The different kinds of ice formations I saw, which as a Floridian was fascinating. And just, lots of snow and how deep the snow was and how it felt to be up there, how quiet it was, what the fire tower was like, what the view was like, and how much the wind rattled on the windows in this fire tower at the top of this mountain. And these are the kinds of sensations we don't often think about unless a writer forces us to. And they're the kinds of sensations that can help us connect with a place in a lot deeper way. So that's one of the things I want us to think about as we go through this, but I want us to try it out with a couple more poems. And so the last exercise I have for you is with a poem called That Most High Arctic of British Birds, which I'll link below. And all I want you to do is kind of read through the poem first, but then I want you to hop on over to Google. Try out Google Earth, looking for the place and what you can see around there. Google some of the places and animals and plants that are described in the poem and see what you can learn about them. What do they look like? Go on over to YouTube and find out what they sound like. These are really cool ways to engage with a piece of work that are not expected of us, but can be extremely valuable to us as readers, and especially to us as writers, because then we can learn the kinds of things that we want people to hear or smell or see or experience when they read our own work. And if we can make those pieces of narrative that we craft in a poem more experiential, then it's going to make a stronger connection with our reader. So there's no assignment connected to this other than I think it would be really cool to go find some of them. So I hope that's something that works for you. This is a poem that's just like chock full of a bunch of toponyms and stuff like that that we can look into. So this will be one of your options for your reader response too. So I hope this works, and we'll do another video in just a second.